A racist police officer unjustly detains a black woman on the street, completely unaware that she is the wife of the police chief. This shocking confrontation ignites a chain of events that challenges systemic bias and exposes the hidden flaws within the police force. Have you ever been in a moment like this, or witnessed someone face discrimination simply because of who they are? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. The sun hung low over Willowbrook, casting long shadows as the city's streets pulsed with life. Amid the chatter of pedestrians and the rhythmic hum of distant traffic, Charlotte moved with quiet confidence. Her presence was understated, yet undeniable, her every step exuding purpose. Around her neck, a golden chain glinted in the sunlight, a simple yet elegant piece that held profound meaning. It was a gift from her husband, David, a symbol of their unshakable bond. As she made her way through the crowd, her focus was singular, her thoughts her own. She didn't notice the patrol car idling nearby, nor the figure leaning against it with a coffee cup in hand. Officer Jack Grant had been watching her. Jack had seen many people walk these streets, but something about Charlotte struck a nerve. She didn't glance his way, didn't quicken her steps, didn't acknowledge his presence in the slightest. Most people reacted to the uniform, whether out of respect or fear, but Charlotte's indifference felt like a deliberate affront. He straightened, his eyes narrowing as they traced the chain around her neck. The gold caught the light, a sharp contrast to the dull monotony of his day. His mind immediately leapt to suspicion. "Hey, you!" he called out, stepping away from his car. Charlotte stopped mid-step, turning slowly toward the voice. Her calm demeanor betrayed no alarm, though her eyes carried a flicker of annoyance. "Yes, officer?" Jack approached, his gaze locked on the chain. "That necklace," he said, his tone sharp. "Where'd you get it?" Charlotte's brow furrowed slightly. "It's mine," she replied, her voice even but firm. "Is there a problem?" "Looks expensive," Jack pressed, ignoring her question. His eyes swept over her, his expression hardening. "Are you sure it's yours? You match the description of someone involved in a theft." A murmur rippled through the crowd as a few passers-by slowed to observe. Charlotte stood her ground, her posture straight and unyielding. "This chain," she said, her voice steady, "was a gift from my husband. I've done nothing wrong." Jack's lips curled into a smirk. "That's what they all say," he muttered, folding his arms. "You don't exactly look like someone who can afford a piece like that." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Charlotte's jaw tightened, but she refused to let anger take hold. "Are you accusing me of something, officer?" Jack took a step closer, his presence looming. "I'm doing my job," he said coldly. "And my job is to question things that don't add up. That necklace doesn't add up." Charlotte exhaled slowly, steadying herself. "If you think I've committed a crime," she said, her voice firm, "you're mistaken. I don't owe you an explanation for something that belongs to me." The tension between them thickened as more onlookers gathered, their curiosity piqued by the confrontation. Phones were raised discreetly, cameras capturing the scene. Jack noticed the crowd but didn't back down. His pride was on the line now, his authority questioned. "Show me some ID," he demanded, his voice hard. Charlotte hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the precarious line she was walking. Giving in might diffuse the tension, but it would also mean yielding to an accusation rooted in nothing but bias. "I don't need to show you anything unless you have a legitimate reason to stop me," she said, her voice unwavering. Jack's eyes darkened, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. "Listen," he said, his tone laced with threat. "I can make this easy, or I can make it difficult. Your choice." Charlotte met his gaze, unflinching. "I know my rights, officer," she said calmly, "and I won't be intimidated into giving them up." For a moment, neither of them moved. The crowd grew larger, the murmurs louder. Jack's hand hovered over his radio, his thoughts clearly torn between escalating the situation and walking away. "You think you're above questioning?" he snapped finally. "You think you can just walk around like you own the place?" Charlotte's voice cut through his tirade, sharp and clear. "No, officer, but I do think I deserve to walk without being harassed for no reason." Jack took another step forward, the space between them shrinking. His towering frame seemed to block out the sun, but Charlotte stood firm, her resolve unshaken. Before Jack could speak again, a voice called out from behind him, firm and commanding. "What's going on here?" Jack turned sharply, his expression shifting from anger to something resembling shock. Standing a few feet away was David, his presence magnetic and undeniable. Dressed in his crisp uniform, his broad shoulders and calm authority immediately shifted the dynamic. Charlotte's heart lifted slightly at the sight of him. though she remained composed. Jack, however, looked like a man caught in the act. "Captain, Reed," Jack stammered, his bravado faltering. David's eyes flicked to Charlotte, then back to Jack. "Care to explain why you're stopping my wife?" The words sent a visible jolt through Jack. He opened his mouth, searching for a response, but nothing came. The crowd watched in rapt silence as the situation took an unexpected turn. "She matched a description," Jack mumbled finally, his voice losing its edge. "I was just following up." David stepped closer, his expression unreadable but commanding. "Is that so?" he said, his tone measured. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're making baseless assumptions, and in front of a crowd no less." Jack's face flushed, his jaw tightening. He glanced at the crowd, their phones still recording, then back at David. "I was doing my job," he said defensively. David's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass citizens based on flimsy suspicions. My wife doesn't owe you anything, especially not her dignity." Jack hesitated, his authority slipping away with every word. He looked as if he wanted to argue, but the weight of David's presence and the growing attention of the crowd left him cornered. "Fine," Jack muttered finally, stepping back. "She's free to go." David didn't move until Jack retreated to his car, his frustration evident in every step. The crowd began to disperse, the tension lingering in the air. Charlotte exhaled slowly, the adrenaline finally ebbing. David turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Charlotte nodded, her voice steady. "I'm fine, but this isn't over." David glanced back at Jack's car, his jaw tightening. "No," he said firmly, "it's not." Jack's footsteps echoed sharply as he closed the distance between himself and Charlotte, his demeanor shifting from casual observation to overt confrontation. "Let's cut to the chase," he said, his voice tight with authority. "That necklace, where exactly did you get it?" Charlotte turned fully to face him, her expression calm but unwavering. "I already told you," she replied, her voice measured. "It's mine. It was a gift from my husband." Jack's eyes narrowed, his gaze darting between her face and the chain. "And I'm supposed to just take your word for it?" His tone dripped with skepticism. "You matched the description of someone we're looking for. A thief, to be exact." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Charlotte blinked, her composure briefly threatened by the sheer audacity of his words. She steadied herself quickly. "A thief?" she repeated, her tone now edged with incredulity. "You're accusing me of stealing? Based on what? My appearance?" Jack folded his arms, his posture stiff. "You look suspicious enough," he said, a smirk creeping onto his face. "And that necklace doesn't exactly scream, honest citizen." The crowd around them began to grow, the quiet hum of curiosity escalating into murmurs of disbelief. Phones were raised, recording the scene. Charlotte noticed but kept her focus on Jack. "This is absurd," she said firmly. "You have no basis for this. If you have evidence, show it. Otherwise, I suggest you stop wasting my time." Jack's jaw tightened. "Evidence or not," he shot back, "it's my job to ask questions. And your attitude isn't helping." "My attitude?" Charlotte's voice sharpened. "You stopped me without reason, accused me of a crime, and now you're blaming me for how I respond?" "Let's not get defensive," Jack retorted, his voice thick with condescension. "If you've got nothing to hide, this'll be over in no time. Just show me some ID and we'll clear this up." Charlotte's hands stayed at her sides, her stance firm. "I know my rights, officer," she said, each word deliberate. "Unless you have probable cause, I don't need to show you anything." The crowd stirred, some voices now audible over the tension. "She's right," a man called out from the sidewalk. "Leave her alone." Jack's head snapped toward the voice, his irritation visible. "Mind your business," he barked, but the distraction cost him. Others began to speak up. "She didn't do anything. This is harassment." Jack's face reddened as the murmurs grew louder. He turned back to Charlotte, his voice hardening. "Don't think a few nosy bystanders will change how this goes. Either you cooperate or we'll take this downtown." Charlotte's heart raced, but she refused to let fear dictate her response. "Take me downtown?" she said, her tone biting. "On what charge, officer? You're escalating because you don't like being challenged." Jack took a step closer, his size meant to intimidate. "Don't test me," he warned, his voice low. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Charlotte didn't flinch. "The only person making this difficult is you," she countered. "You're using your badge to bully someone who's done nothing wrong." The phones recording the scene tilted closer, capturing every word. Jack noticed but pressed on. "Enough of this," he snapped. "If you won't show me ID, I'll have to assume you're hiding something." Charlotte's expression darkened, anger flickering beneath her calm exterior. "You've already decided I'm guilty," she said, "and we both know why." The statement landed heavily, a pointed jab that made Jack's face tighten further. His hand hovered over his radio, the threat of escalation palpable. "Look, lady," he said, his voice sharp. "You think this is about you? This is about me doing my job. And right now, my job is making sure people like you don't walk away with stolen goods." "People like me?" Charlotte shot back, her voice rising. "You mean people who don't fit your narrow idea of who belongs here, or who deserve to own something valuable?" The crowd reacted audibly, murmurs turning into scattered shouts of agreement. Jack's frustration grew. He looked around, realizing the situation was slipping out of his control. "All right, enough," he barked, his voice rising. "You can argue all you want, but the law's the law. Either you cooperate, or we'll settle this back at the station." A voice from the crowd cut through the tension. "You're out of line, officer." It was a woman, stepping forward with her phone held high. "We're all seeing this. She hasn't done anything wrong, and you know it." Jack turned toward the woman, his anger now barely contained. "I said, back off," he snapped. "Interfering won't help her." Charlotte seized the moment, her voice steady but resolute. "This is what you do, isn't it?" she said, her words cutting through the noise. "You rely on fear and intimidation to silence people, but I won't be silenced." The crowd responded with murmurs of approval, emboldened by her defiance. Jack, now visibly flustered, pointed a finger at Charlotte. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he sneered. "You think a little speech will get you out of this?" Charlotte took a step forward, her confidence unshaken. "No, officer," she said, her tone firm. "But standing up to people like you might make it harder for you to pull this on someone else." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound overwhelming. Jack's face burned with humiliation as he stepped back, his authority slipping through his fingers. For a moment, it seemed he might retreat entirely, but his hand moved toward his radio again. "That's enough," he growled, his voice lower now. "You're coming with me." Before he could act, a new voice rang out. "What's going on here?" The crowd turned as one, and Jack froze. Stepping forward with calm authority was David, his presence immediately commanding attention. His eyes swept the scene, taking in Jack, Charlotte, and the growing crowd. Jack's jaw tightened, his bravado faltering. "Captain Reed," he muttered, his voice barely audible. David's gaze fixed on him, sharp and unrelenting. "Care to explain why you're harassing my wife?" Jack stammered, his confidence crumbling. "I was just questioning..." "Questioning what?" David cut him off, his voice cold. "Because from where I'm standing, this looks a lot like harassment, and I'd love to hear your justification." The crowd fell silent, the tension shifting as David stepped closer. Jack's posture deflated, his authority gone. "It was a misunderstanding," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "Misunderstanding?" David repeated, his tone icy. "You've escalated this into a public spectacle with no cause. That's not a misunderstanding. It's misconduct." Jack's face flushed, but he said nothing. David turned to Charlotte, his voice softening. "Are you all right?" "I am now," Charlotte replied, her voice steady. David nodded, then turned back to Jack. "You're done here," he said firmly. "Step away." Jack hesitated but finally stepped back, the weight of David's authority undeniable. The crowd began to disperse, their phones still recording as Jack retreated to his patrol car. David watched him go, then turned back to Charlotte. "Let's go," he said quietly. "This isn't over." Charlotte nodded, her resolve unbroken. "No, it's not." The air between Charlotte and Jack was electric with tension, their standoff drawing more attention by the second. Jack's hand hovered near his radio, his expression twisted between frustration and determination, when a deep, authoritative voice cut through the rising chaos. "Officer Grant," the voice called sharply. "What exactly is going on here?" Jack froze, his head jerking toward the source of the voice. The crowd turned as well, revealing David Reed stepping forward with purposeful strides. His presence was magnetic, his tall frame and composed demeanor demanding respect without effort. He was impeccably dressed in his captain's uniform, the insignia on his chest a silent declaration of his authority. Charlotte's shoulders eased slightly at the sight of her husband, though her gaze stayed locked on Jack, her resolve unshaken. David's eyes moved from Jack to Charlotte, quickly taking in the scene before him, the defensive stance of his wife, the crowd with their phones raised, and the tension radiating from the officer standing before her. "David," Charlotte said calmly, though there was a weight of relief in her tone. David gave her a quick nod before his sharp gaze settled fully on Jack. "I'll ask again," he said, his voice cold and clipped. "What's happening here?" Jack hesitated, his usual confidence faltering. "Captain Reed," he started, his tone laced with a forced politeness. "I was just, investigating a possible theft." David's brow arched, his expression unreadable but steely. "Investigating a theft?" he repeated slowly. With her? He gestured toward Charlotte without breaking eye contact with Jack. Jack cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. Yes, sir, he said quickly. She matches the description of— Enough, David interrupted, his tone sharper now. You're telling me that out of everyone on this street, you decided that my wife, a woman walking alone with no signs of suspicious behavior, fits the description of a criminal? Jack's jaw tightened, his pride warring with the reality of the situation. Sir, I was just following up on a report. I thought it was worth checking. Worth checking? David's voice was low but cutting, his words slicing through Jack's excuses. What exactly about her seemed worth checking? Her confidence? Her necklace? Or maybe something else entirely? The crowd murmured at the implication, their interest reigniting as David pressed forward. Jack shifted uncomfortably, his hand dropping from his radio as he tried to regain control of the situation. With all due respect, Captain, Jack said, his tone strained, I was doing my job. If she had just cooperated, David took a deliberate step closer, cutting him off mid-sentence. Do not, he said firmly, blame your incompetence on her. Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass citizens with baseless accusations. Do you even have probable cause? Jack's face reddened as he struggled to respond. She refused to show ID, he blurted out. David's eyes narrowed, his patience clearly wearing thin. She doesn't have to show ID unless you have legitimate grounds to request it, which, from what I've seen, you don't. Jack opened his mouth to protest, but David didn't give him the chance. You've escalated this into a public spectacle, he continued, his tone cold and measured. You've wasted time, resources, and the patience of this community. And now you're doubling down on a mistake instead of admitting you were wrong. The crowd, emboldened by David's words, began to murmur louder. Someone shouted, "He's right," while another chimed in, "You're just making it worse, man." Jack shot a glare toward the crowd, his irritation evident. "This isn't about them," he snapped, before quickly turning his attention back to David. "Captain, I didn't mean—" "No," David interrupted again, his tone final. "You didn't mean to get caught. That's what this is about." The words struck like a hammer, leaving Jack momentarily speechless. He glanced at Charlotte, who stood with her arms crossed, her unwavering gaze a stark contrast to his flustered demeanor. "You're embarrassing yourself, Officer Grant," David said, stepping back slightly but keeping his voice firm. "And you're embarrassing this department. Do you understand the weight of your actions right now?" Jack's pride flared, his fists clenching at his sides. "Captain, with all due respect," David's voice turned icy, "you're about to lose whatever respect you think you have. Step back. Now." Jack hesitated, glancing toward the patrol car as if weighing his options. The crowd's phone stayed raised, capturing every second of his faltering response. Finally, he took a step back, his shoulders tense and his expression a mix of anger and humiliation. "Fine," Jack muttered, barely audible. "She's free to go." David didn't move, his piercing gaze locked on Jack. "You'll report to my office first thing tomorrow morning," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And you better have a damn good explanation for what just happened here." Jack nodded stiffly, his face burning as he turned and walked back to his patrol car. The crowd parted to let him through, their murmurs fading into a tense silence. David exhaled slowly before turning to Charlotte, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" Charlotte nodded, her voice steady. "I'm fine," she said, "but this needs to stop. Not just for me, for everyone." David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his jaw tightening. "It will," he said firmly. "This isn't over." The crowd began to disperse, their phones lowering as the tension ebbed. A few people gave Charlotte encouraging nods or murmured words of support before walking away. As the street cleared, David glanced toward the patrol car, where Jack sat staring straight ahead, his hands gripping the wheel. Turning back to Charlotte, David's voice softened. "Let's go home," he said. Charlotte nodded again, though the fire in her eyes hadn't dimmed. "We have a lot to talk about," she said quietly. David gave her a small nod, his expression resolute. "We'll deal with this," he said, his voice calm but firm. Together. The two walked away, leaving behind a scene that would linger in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. For David, this was more than a public confrontation. It was a turning point, one that would test the very foundations of the justice system he had sworn to uphold. The slam of the front door echoed through the house as Charlotte dropped her bag on the nearest chair. She turned sharply to face David, who had barely stepped inside and was shutting the door behind him. "You're the captain of the police department, David," she began. her voice tight with frustration. And I still had to stand there and defend myself against one of your officers in the middle of the street. Do you know how humiliating that was? David sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly as he leaned against the wall. Charlotte, I came as fast as I could. The second I saw what was happening, I stepped in. You shouldn't have had to step in, she shot back, her tone rising. It shouldn't have happened in the first place. What does it say about the department you run if someone like Jack feels empowered to pull something like that? David's jaw tightened. You think I don't know how bad it was? I was furious, Charlotte. He overstepped, and I'll make sure he faces consequences for it. Charlotte crossed her arms, her eyes blazing. You'll make sure? That's not enough, David. Do you think this is the first time he's done something like this? Or the last? What are you going to do? Write him up? Give him a slap on the wrist? Meanwhile, people like me are left to deal with the fallout. David stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. That's not how I operate. I'll handle this the right way. Charlotte let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. The right way? How long have you been trying to do things the right way, David? And what's changed? I was humiliated today, not because of anything I did, but because of the system you're a part of. David bristled at her words, his frustration bubbling to the surface. I'm not the enemy here, Charlotte. I'm the one who stepped in and stopped him. I've spent years trying to make things better from the inside, and you know how hard that is. And yet here we are, Charlotte's voice cracked with anger. After all your years in the department, after all your promises about change, I'm still treated like a criminal for daring to walk down the street wearing a necklace. If this is how I'm treated as your wife, what happens to people who don't have you to swoop in and save the day? David's hands clenched into fists at his sides. You think I don't know that? You think I don't see it every day? I fight it every damn day, Charlotte, and it's exhausting. Then fight harder, Charlotte snapped, her voice breaking under the weight of her emotions. Because today, I didn't feel like your wife. I felt like just another name on their list of suspects. And it's killing me, David. The silence that followed was deafening. Both of them stood rooted in place, the intensity of their words hanging in the air between them. David finally exhaled, running a hand over his face. I hate that this happened to you. I hate that I wasn't there sooner. But don't for a second think I don't understand what this is about. I've seen it. Hell, I've lived it. That's why I took this job, why I stayed in this system. I thought I could change it. Charlotte's arms dropped to her sides, her expression softening slightly as she watched the tension etched into his face. And have you? She asked, her tone quieter now. David looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and pain. Not enough, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Charlotte stepped closer, her anger giving way to resolve. Then this can't just be another incident that gets brushed under the rug, David. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been treated like this. And you're in a position to do something about it. David met her gaze, his shoulders still heavy with the weight of the day. What if I can't? He asked quietly. What if the system pushes back harder than I can handle? I've seen what happens to people who rock the boat too much. Then you'll keep fighting, Charlotte said firmly. Because that's what needs to happen. You have the power to hold people like Jack accountable. And if you don't use it, then what's the point of any of this? David's eyes lingered on her, the strength in her words cutting through his doubt. He nodded slowly, his resolve beginning to return. You're right, he said. This isn't just about you or us. It's about fixing what's broken. Charlotte placed a hand on his arm, her voice softening further. We can't do it alone, David, but you have a platform and I have a voice. If we work together, maybe we can make a real difference. David sighed, the weight of the task ahead sinking in. It's not going to be easy, he warned. It never is, Charlotte replied, her tone unwavering. But that doesn't mean it's not worth it. David nodded again, this time with more conviction. I'll start the process tomorrow, he said. Jack needs to be held accountable, and not just him. If there are others like him in the department, they need to know this behavior won't be tolerated. Charlotte gave him a small, determined smile. Good, she said. Because I'm not letting this go, David, and neither should you. For the first time since the confrontation, a sense of purpose settled between them. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was one they would face together. David sat in his office, the atmosphere tense as he drafted the initial report to launch the internal investigation into Jack's behavior. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing the first words. It wasn't just a report. It was the first step in challenging a deeply entrenched culture within the Willowbrook Police Department. The door creaked open, and Detective Harris stepped in without knocking. A senior officer with years on the force, Harris had seen it all and wasn't shy about sharing his opinion. "You really going through with this, David?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. David didn't look up. "Yes, Jack's actions need to be addressed." Harris let out a short laugh. "Addressed? We're talking about one bad interaction, not a felony. Don't you think this is overkill? People make mistakes." David's eyes snapped up, his gaze cold. "Mistakes. Harris, Jack humiliated an innocent woman on a public street. My wife. That's not a mistake. It's a pattern of behavior I won't ignore." Harris stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're poking the hornet's nest, Captain. The department doesn't look kindly on internal investigations, and you know that. This will divide the team." David leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "If the team can't handle accountability, maybe it's time for some division." Harris shook his head. "You're making enemies, David. Think about your career. Think about how this will play out." David stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "I don't care about my career right now, Harris. What I care about is doing the right thing. If you're here to dissuade me, you're wasting your time." Harris held his gaze for a moment before shaking his head again and walking out, muttering under his breath. Meanwhile, Charlotte was busy rallying support from the community. She had spent the morning reaching out to witnesses who had been present during the confrontation. With every call she made, she felt the growing weight of the task. One woman, an elderly resident named Mrs. Jenkins, was hesitant at first. "I don't want to get involved, dear," she said nervously. "I've seen what happens to people who speak up against the police." Charlotte's voice was steady but firm. "Mrs. Jenkins, the only way this stops is if people like us stand up and say it's wrong. What happened to me could happen to anyone." There was a long pause on the other end before Mrs. Jenkins finally relented. "All right, I'll tell them what I saw, but I'm trusting you to keep me safe." "I promise," Charlotte said, her resolve hardening. Her next call was to a local activist group that had been advocating for police reform in Willowbrook. Their leader, Maya Perez, was immediately supportive. "We've been waiting for a case like this to shed light on what's happening," Maya said. "We'll organize a rally, get the community involved. The more pressure we apply, the harder it'll be for them to sweep this under the rug." Charlotte thanked her, feeling a flicker of hope. For the first time, she began to see the outlines of a larger movement forming around her. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was shifting. David's decision to open an investigation had sent ripples through the department. Some officers voiced quiet support, while others grumbled openly about betraying the Brotherhood. In the break room, Jack was holding court with a small group of officers, his tone dripping with contempt. "Can you believe this?" he said, pacing back and forth. "The captain's throwing me under the bus over a nothing incident. All because his wife didn't like being questioned." Officer Kowalski, one of Jack's closest allies, nodded. "It's bullshit. Everyone knows you didn't do anything wrong. The guy's just trying to save face at your expense." Jack smirked. "Exactly. He's using me to make some big statement. Well, I'm not going down without a fight." Another officer, Johnson, spoke up hesitantly. "Jack, maybe it's not about you. Maybe you did cross a line." Jack's face darkened as he stepped toward Johnson. "You saying I'm the problem?" Johnson raised his hands defensively. "I'm just saying, maybe there's a way to de-escalate this before it gets out of hand." Jack scoffed, turning back to Kowalski. "Unbelievable. You see what I'm dealing with here? This department used to have loyalty. Now, it's every man for himself." That evening, David called a meeting with his senior staff to outline the next steps of the investigation. As he explained the process, he could feel the tension in the room. Lieutenant Sanders, one of the more vocal critics of the investigation, interrupted him. "Captain, don't you think this is a bit much? Jack's a good cop. He's been on the force for years. Are we really going to tear him apart over one incident?" David's jaw tightened. This isn't about tearing anyone apart, Sanders. It's about accountability. If Jack's behavior goes unchecked, it sends a message that this kind of conduct is acceptable. And it's not. Sanders leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. As well as I do that this department has bigger problems than Jack. Why single him out? Because, David said firmly, change starts somewhere. And if Jack's actions are indicative of a larger issue, then it's time we address it. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the group. As the investigation officially began, Charlotte's efforts were gaining traction. The rally organized by Maya Perez drew a large crowd, with people from all walks of life showing up to demand justice. Charlotte stood at the front, speaking into a megaphone. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice strong. "It's about every person who's ever been treated unfairly. It's about a system that needs to change, and we won't stop until it does." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy palpable. Charlotte felt a surge of determination as she looked out at the sea of faces. They weren't just fighting for her. They were fighting for everyone who had been silenced. Back at the precinct, the fractures within the department were becoming more visible. Some officers openly supported David's decision, while others aligned themselves with Jack, creating an undercurrent of tension that threatened to boil over. Late one night, David found a note slipped under his office door. It read, "Watch your back. Some people don't like traitors." David stared at the note, his expression unreadable. He knew this battle wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he couldn't back down. He picked up his phone and dialed Charlotte. "How's it going on your end?" he asked. "We're making progress," she said. "But this is bigger than I thought. There's so much anger, so much pain." David nodded, though she couldn't see him. "Same here," he said. "It's getting messy. But we're in this together, right?" "Always," Charlotte replied. David hung up, his resolve hardening. The fight was just beginning, but he was ready for it. David's office door slammed shut, and Captain Henry Bennett entered, his face tight with controlled anger. Without preamble, he placed both hands on David's desk and leaned forward. "David," Bennett began, his voice low but pointed. "We need to talk. And I'm not here for a polite chat." David folded his arms, his expression calm but resolute. "Then say what you came to say, Captain." Bennett straightened, pacing behind the chair across from David. "You're pushing this investigation too far. It's one officer, one incident. Do you understand the kind of division this is causing in the department?" David met his gaze, unflinching. "I understand that accountability isn't supposed to be comfortable. If it's causing division, then maybe it's time we take a hard look at why that is." Bennett's jaw tightened, his voice rising. "Don't get self-righteous with me. I've been doing this a hell of a lot longer than you. There's a way things work around here, and you're stepping out of line." David stood, matching Bennett's intensity. "If stepping out of line means holding officers accountable for abusing their power, then I'm fine with that. Jack's behavior was unacceptable, and you know it." Bennett's eyes narrowed. "Let me be clear. If you keep pushing, you're going to isolate yourself. The department doesn't take kindly to captains who air dirty laundry. You'll lose your team's respect, and maybe your job." David's voice remained steady, but there was steel behind it. "If the respect of my team is built on looking the other way, I don't want it." The two men stared at each other, the tension palpable. Finally, Bennett shook his head, muttering under his breath. "Don't say I didn't warn you." He turned sharply and exited, slamming the door behind him. Meanwhile, Jack was escalating his tactics. That evening, David and Charlotte returned home to find an envelope taped to their front door. David opened it cautiously, revealing a single sheet of paper with the words, "Drop it, or you'll regret it." Charlotte frowned as she read over his shoulder. "This is Jack, isn't it?" David nodded grimly. "It's his style. Cowardly and underhanded." Charlotte's phone buzzed on the counter, drawing her attention. When she checked, there was an anonymous text. "Your little crusade won't end well. Stay in your lane." She handed the phone to David, her expression hardening. "He's not just targeting you anymore. This is personal." David set the phone down, his jaw tightening. It was always personal to him. Jack can't stand being challenged, especially by someone he underestimated. But he's only proving why this investigation is necessary. Charlotte crossed her arms. So what's next? Do we ignore this, or do we take action? We document everything, David said firmly. Every threat, every attempt to intimidate us. He's digging his own grave. The next day, Jack's retaliation became more direct. As Charlotte left a meeting with community organizers, she noticed a dark car idling at the corner. She didn't recognize the vehicle, but it felt off, like someone was watching her. As she walked to her car, the dark vehicle slowly rolled forward. The driver's window was slightly cracked, but the tint obscured the occupant's face. Charlotte quickened her pace, her heart pounding. When she reached her car and got inside, the dark vehicle sped off. She watched it disappear around the corner before taking a deep breath to steady herself. That evening, David found her inspecting their car in the driveway. "What's going on?" he asked, noticing the tense set of her shoulders. Charlotte pointed to the passenger side. "Someone slashed the tires." David's expression darkened as he knelt to inspect the damage. "Jack," he muttered. Charlotte nodded. "Who else? He's sending a message." David stood, his fists clenched. "It's not just a message. It's intimidation. He wants us to back down." "Well, he's wasting his time," Charlotte said firmly. "If anything, this makes me more determined." David looked at her, his resolve mirrored in her expression. "We'll report this, but we can't count on the department to take it seriously. Jack's got friends protecting him." Charlotte crossed her arms. "Then we make it impossible for them to ignore. If they won't act, we'll expose it ourselves." The atmosphere at the precinct was growing more hostile by the day. Jack's allies were emboldened, and whispers of discontent spread like wildfire. David's once solid relationships with his officers were fracturing under the weight of the investigation. In a meeting with his senior staff, the tension was evident. Lieutenant Sanders, who had been vocal in his opposition, finally spoke up. "Captain," Sanders began, his tone sharp, "this investigation is tearing the department apart. Morale is at an all-time low, and it's because of you." David raised an eyebrow. "Morale is low because some of you think accountability is optional," he replied. "If that's the case, maybe the problem isn't the investigation." Sanders leaned forward, his voice rising. "Jack's been with us for years. He's made mistakes, sure, but he's one of us. You're acting like he's a criminal when all he did was try to do his job." David's voice was calm but firm. His job is to protect and serve, not to harass innocent people. If you can't see the difference, then you're part of the problem. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. That night, another letter arrived at David and Charlotte's home. This one was more explicit, with a crude drawing of a gravestone bearing David's name. Below it, the words, "Keep going, and you'll end up here." Charlotte stared at the paper, her face pale but resolute. "He's not even trying to hide his intent anymore," she said. David placed the letter in a file with the others. "He's desperate. He knows he's losing control." Charlotte met his gaze. "Do you think he's capable of following through on these threats?" David hesitated before answering. "I don't know, but we can't afford to take chances." Charlotte nodded. "Then we stay vigilant, and we don't let fear stop us." David reached for her hand, his grip firm. "We'll get through this. Together." Charlotte's voice was steady. "We will. But we need to act fast. The longer this drags on, the more emboldened he'll become." David's phone buzzed with a message from a fellow officer. "Be careful, Captain. Some of us support you, but not everyone has your back." He read the message aloud, then looked at Charlotte. "It's not just Jack. This goes deeper than I thought." Charlotte's jaw tightened. "Then it's time to expose all of it." David nodded, his determination renewed. "We will. But first, we need to make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." The courthouse steps were crowded with people holding signs and chanting slogans, their voices echoing across the plaza. At the heart of the demonstration, Charlotte stood tall, a megaphone in her hand, and determination etched into her expression. "This isn't just about one officer," she began, her voice steady but powerful, carrying over the noise of the crowd. "It's about a system that protects bad behavior and punishes those who dare to stand up against it. What happened to me isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern, and that pattern needs to end." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy palpable. Cameras from local and national news outlets zoomed in, capturing the moment. Civil rights advocates and community leaders stood behind Charlotte, lending their presence as a sign of solidarity. "We're not asking for change," Charlotte continued, her voice growing stronger. "We're demanding it. Because accountability shouldn't be optional. It shouldn't depend on who you are or what you look like." Maya Perez, the activist leader who had helped organize the rally, stepped forward and took the megaphone. "Charlotte Reed is fighting for all of us," Maya said. "And we're here to show that she's not alone. Together, we can push back against this culture of silence and complicity. Together, we can make Willowbrook a safer, fairer place for everyone." The crowd cheered again, the atmosphere charged with hope and defiance. Inside the police precinct, David sat at his desk, poring over documents related to the investigation. The door creaked open, and a young officer stepped in. Rachel Myers, one of the department's newer recruits, hesitated briefly before speaking. "Captain Reed," she began, her voice low. "Can I talk to you privately?" David gestured for her to sit. "What's on your mind?" Rachel glanced toward the hallway to ensure no one was listening before closing the door. "I've been hearing things about Jack, about this investigation, and I think you need to know what's really going on." David leaned forward, his attention sharp. "Go on." Rachel took a deep breath. "Jack's been bragging about how untouchable he is. He's got people in the department backing him up, covering for him. I've seen them altering reports, downplaying complaints against him. It's not just this incident. There's a pattern of misconduct, and it goes back years." David's jaw tightened. "Do you have evidence?" Rachel nodded. "I've been keeping copies of everything I've found. I didn't know who to trust, but I can't stay silent anymore. This isn't what I signed up for." David's voice softened slightly. "You're doing the right thing, Rachel. But this won't be easy. If Jack finds out you're helping me, he'll come after you." "I'm ready for that," Rachel said firmly. "I can't just stand by and let this continue." David nodded, his respect for her growing. "Get me everything you have. This might be the breakthrough we need." As the rally continued outside, Charlotte noticed a small group of men lingering at the edge of the crowd. They weren't holding signs or chanting. Their expressions were hard, their stares fixed on her with unmistakable hostility. She nudged Maya, who followed her gaze. "Do you know them?" Charlotte asked. Maya shook her head. "No, but I don't like the way they're looking at you." Charlotte set her jaw. "Let them look. They're not going to scare me off." Maya hesitated. "Just be careful. These rallies bring out all kinds of people. Not all of them here to support us." Charlotte nodded but didn't let her focus waver. She returned to the megaphone, her voice ringing out with renewed strength. "We're here today because silence is no longer an option. We're here because change won't happen unless we demand it." The group of men continued to watch, their presence a quiet but persistent reminder of the risks Charlotte was taking. Later that evening, David and Charlotte sat in their living room, exhausted but resolute. Charlotte had just finished recounting the events of the rally when David shared Rachel's revelations. "She's risking a lot by coming forward," David said. "But if what she's saying checks out, it could blow this case wide open." Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what we need. But it also means Jack's going to fight harder. If he thinks we're getting too close, he'll escalate." David's phone buzzed, interrupting their conversation. It was a text from an unknown number. "Nice rally today. Watch your back." He showed the message to Charlotte, who frowned. "He's getting desperate." David nodded grimly. "And dangerous. We need to stay ahead of him." Charlotte's expression hardened. "Then we keep pushing. If we let him intimidate us, he wins." The next day, Rachel delivered a folder of documents to David's office. It contained altered reports, dismissed complaints, and other evidence of Jack's misconduct. "This is everything I've got," Rachel said. "But I'm sure there's more if we dig deeper." David flipped through the papers, his anger growing with each page. "This is damning," he said. "Thank you for bringing this forward, Rachel." "It took courage," Rachel nodded. "Just tell me what else you need, Captain. I'm all in." As Rachel left the office, David felt a renewed sense of determination. He immediately contacted Charlotte, updating her on the developments. "This changes everything," Charlotte said, "but we need to make sure it doesn't get buried." "It won't," David promised. "Not this time." That evening, Charlotte attended a meeting with Maya and other community leaders. They discussed the next steps for the movement, including plans for a larger rally and a petition demanding broader reforms within the police department. "This is bigger than Jack," Maya said. "It's about addressing the culture that allows people like him to thrive." Charlotte nodded. "And we have the evidence now. If we make it public, they won't be able to ignore us." Maya smiled. "Let's make it happen." As the night wore on, Charlotte and David found themselves facing yet another act of intimidation. The headlights of a car flashed into their living room window, lingering for an uncomfortably long time before speeding off. David grabbed his phone, dialing Rachel. "Keep an eye out," he warned her. "I think Jack's people are starting to push back." "I will," Rachel replied. "And don't worry, I'm not backing down." Neither were David and Charlotte. Despite the threats, the intimidation, and the growing risks, they remained steadfast in their commitment to justice. Jack sat in the back of a bar with two other officers, his voice low but laced with venom. "They think they're untouchable," he muttered, nursing a beer. "Captain Reed and his wife are playing the system like it's their personal soapbox. It's disgusting." Officer Kowalski leaned in, nodding. "People are already talking. Word is, they're using this whole thing to push some kind of political agenda. Make David look like a hero, Charlotte like some kind of martyr. That's exactly what they're doing," Jack said with a smirk. "They're hungry for attention and the department's paying the price. But I've got a few friends who don't mind setting the record straight." By morning, rumors began circulating through the precinct. Whispers turned into bold assertions. David was exploiting his position for personal gain. Charlotte was fabricating threats to stay in the spotlight, and their entire campaign was a ploy for fame and financial support. One officer, emboldened by Jack's narrative, approached Rachel Myers in the hallway. "Better be careful who you're siding with, Myers," he said with a sneer. "You don't want to go down with them when this blows up in their faces." Rachel shot him a cold look. "Funny, I thought the only thing blowing up was Jack's career." She brushed past him, refusing to be intimidated. The pressure on Captain Henry Bennett was mounting. He had been fielding calls from angry higher-ups, concerned citizens, and reporters all week. The investigation had thrown the department into turmoil, and Bennett was bearing the brunt of the backlash. When David walked into Bennett's office that afternoon, he was met with a scowl. "Close the door," Bennett said curtly. David complied, his expression unreadable. "What's this about, Captain?" Bennett gestured toward his desk, which was cluttered with papers and his phone blinking with unanswered calls. "This investigation is ripping the department apart," he said bluntly. "I've got half my officers walking on eggshells, the other half accusing you of a witch hunt. And let's not even get into the media circus outside. That circus wouldn't exist if Jack had been held accountable from the start," David replied evenly. Bennett leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about Jack. It's about the department's reputation, about public trust. And you're dragging it through the mud." David's jaw tightened. "Public trust? That trust was already broken when officers like Jack abused their power. I'm trying to fix it." "Well, your way isn't working," Bennett snapped. "Effective immediately, you're on administrative leave." David's eyes narrowed. "You're suspending me?" Bennett nodded, his tone firm. "Conflict of interest. You're too close to this. Take some time to cool off and let the department handle it." David's fists clenched, but he forced his voice to stay calm. "You're not doing this to protect the department. You're doing this to protect yourself." Bennett didn't flinch. "Call it what you want, but until further notice, you're out." David rose from his chair, his expression hard. "This isn't over," he said before walking out, slamming the door behind him. Charlotte sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone when David walked in, his face taut with frustration. She looked up. "What happened?" David tossed his keys on the counter. "Bennett suspended me. Conflict of interest," he said. Charlotte exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair. "Of course he did. He's caving under the pressure." David shook his head, pacing the room. "They're trying to shut me down, Charlotte. To discredit everything we've worked for." Before Charlotte could respond, her phone buzzed with a text. The message read, "Careful, Mrs. Reed. Heroes fall hard." She showed it to David, her lips pressing into a thin line. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. David sat down beside her, his voice low. They want us to back off. To let this die quietly. Charlotte's gaze hardened. That's not happening. Later that day, Charlotte met with Laura Hayes, a prominent civil rights lawyer known for taking on cases against systemic injustice. The two women sat across from each other in Laura's office, the air heavy with determination. I've been following your story, Laura began, leaning forward. What happened to you is unacceptable, but it's also an opportunity to shine a light on something bigger. Charlotte nodded. That's what we've been trying to do, but the threats are escalating, and now they've suspended David. Laura's eyes narrowed. Retaliation. Classic move. They want to isolate you, make you feel powerless. They're failing, Charlotte said firmly. If anything, it's making us fight harder. Laura smiled. Good, because this is going to be a fight. But you're not alone. I'm prepared to take this to court if necessary. We can't let them silence you. Charlotte exhaled, a mix of relief and determination washing over her. Thank you, Laura. We're ready for whatever comes next. That evening, David and Charlotte sat in their living room, reviewing the evidence Rachel had provided. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on them, but neither was willing to give in. We have the evidence, Charlotte said. We have the community's support. And now, we have Laura. They're running out of ways to stop us. David nodded, though his expression was guarded. Jack's not done yet. He's going to push harder. We need to be ready. Charlotte placed a hand on his arm, her voice steady. We will be, together. Across town, Jack was meeting with a small group of officers in a dimly lit diner. He slammed his fist on the table. They're not backing down, he growled. And now they've got a damn lawyer involved. Kowalski leaned in, his tone conspiratorial. Then we make it clear what happens when people cross us. No more warnings, no more games, Jack smirked. Exactly. If they want a war, we'll give them one. By the time the story hit national headlines, the tension in Willowbrook was at a breaking point. News outlets plastered the images of Charlotte standing defiantly at the rally, megaphone in hand, her voice calling for justice. Headlines screamed about systemic racism, abuse of power, and a department embroiled in scandal. Police captain suspended amid investigation into officer misconduct. Harassment or procedure. A town divided over policing practices. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, eager for statements from activists and officials alike. Civil rights leaders joined the fray, their voices amplifying Charlotte's cause. The story was no longer just about her confrontation with Jack. It had become a flashpoint in the national conversation about police accountability. In the town square, a sea of protesters filled the streets, their signs held high. Justice for all. End police corruption. Hold officers accountable. Maya Perez stood alongside Charlotte, the two women leading the chants as the crowd surged forward. This isn't just a moment, Maya shouted into the megaphone. This is a movement. We're here to demand justice, not just for Charlotte, but for everyone who has suffered at the hands of a broken system. The crowd roared in agreement, their voices reverberating through the streets. Charlotte took the megaphone next, her words cutting through the noise like a blade. We will not be silenced, she declared. Not by threats, not by intimidation, and certainly not by a system that refuses to hold itself accountable. Change is coming to Willowbrook, whether they like it or not. As the crowd cheered, Charlotte noticed several news cameras trained on her. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her, but she refused to falter. Inside the Willowbrook Police Department, Captain Bennett paced his office, his phone buzzing with calls from city officials. The mayor's voice blared through the speaker. Bennett, this situation is out of control, the mayor snapped. We're getting calls from civil rights groups, national reporters, even Congress people. What the hell is going on in your department? We're handling it, Bennett replied tersely. Handling it? The mayor retorted. From where I'm sitting, it looks like your department is imploding. If you don't get this under control, you won't have a department left to run. Bennett clenched his jaw as the call ended, slamming the phone onto his desk. The pressure was mounting from every direction, and his attempts to bury the investigation were becoming increasingly futile. Jack, however, remained defiant. In a quiet corner of a local diner, he met with Kowalski and a few other loyalists. This is a smear campaign, Jack said, his voice bitter. They're dragging the department's name through the mud because of one stupid incident, And now they've got the whole damn country watching. Kowalski leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. So what's the plan? Sit back and let them win? Jack smirked. Not a chance. We dig up dirt on Charlotte, on Reed, anything we can use to discredit them. If they want to fight, we'll give them one. Meanwhile, Charlotte and David were at home, reviewing the latest media coverage. The national attention brought both hope and concern. They're finally listening, Charlotte said, scrolling through social media posts from people across the country expressing support. But it also means Jack and his allies will fight harder to protect themselves. David nodded. They're already trying to spin this. I've heard whispers in the department about false accusations and so-called ulterior motives. Charlotte set her phone down, her expression hardening. Let them talk. We have the truth on our side. And the louder they get, the more desperate they look. David leaned forward, his voice low. The question is, how far are they willing to go? We need to stay vigilant. They won't play fair. The next protest was the largest yet. Thousands of people flooded Willowbrook's main streets, their chants echoing for miles. The rally was joined by representatives from national civil rights organizations, amplifying the movement's reach. On stage, Charlotte was flanked by Maya and Laura Hayes, the civil rights lawyer who had taken on their case. The crowd erupted as Laura took the microphone. This fight isn't just about one bad officer or one broken department, Laura said, her voice sharp and commanding. This is about dismantling the culture that allows corruption and abuse to thrive, and we won't stop until justice is served. The crowd roared, their energy electric. Reporters swarmed the scene, capturing every moment for their broadcasts. Back at the police department, tensions boiled over. Officers who supported David's efforts clashed with those loyal to Jack, the divide growing wider with each passing day. You're just going to let them tear us apart? Sanders, one of Jack's supporters, demanded during a heated meeting with Bennett. What do you want me to do, Sanders? Bennett shot back. March out there and start arresting protesters? That'll just make things worse. Then shut this down, Sanders said. Find a way to discredit them before they destroy us. Bennett's silence spoke volumes. He was caught between the department's growing dysfunction and the unrelenting pressure from outside forces. David, still suspended but far from idle, was meeting with Rachel Myers to strategize their next move. They're on the defensive, Rachel said, handing David a stack of reports she had compiled. The more they push back, the more they expose themselves. If we keep pressing, they'll crack. David nodded, flipping through the documents. This is good, but we need more. The public's on our side now, and we can't let that momentum slip. Rachel hesitated before speaking again. Be careful, Captain. The more desperate they get, the more dangerous they become. That night, Charlotte received another anonymous message. This one was more direct. Enough is enough. Back off, or you'll regret it. She showed it to David, her expression calm but resolute. They think this will scare us? David shook his head. It's a sign that we're winning. But it also means we're getting close to their breaking point. Charlotte's voice was firm. Then we keep going. We don't stop until the truth comes out. David placed a hand on hers. We won't. The fight wasn't over, but they were closer than ever to exposing the corruption that had plagued Willowbrook for too long. The atmosphere in the conference room was heavy with tension. Captain Bennett sat at the head of the table, flanked by senior officers, while David stood near the opposite end. Despite being suspended, he had been summoned for this meeting, a clear attempt to pressure him into abandoning his investigation. Bennett adjusted his tie, his expression neutral but his tone clipped. Reed, let's get straight to it. This investigation has gone far enough. It's tearing the department apart, and frankly, I don't see the benefit in dragging this out any longer. David didn't flinch. The benefit is accountability, Captain. Jack's actions were inexcusable, and this department needs to prove it stands for justice, not cover-ups. Bennett leaned forward, his voice lowering. You're thinking emotionally, not rationally. I get it, Reed. This involves your wife, but emotions have no place in decisions like this. Drop the investigation before you do irreparable damage to the department's reputation. David took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. The department's reputation is already damaged, Captain. You're just too scared to admit it. If we back down now, we're telling the world that people like Jack can abuse their power without consequences. I won't let that happen. Bennett exhaled sharply, his frustration bubbling to the surface. You're acting like a crusader, Reed. You think you can take on the entire system? You'll lose. You'll take this department down with you. David's voice hardened. If the system protects officers like Jack, then it deserves to be taken down. We're supposed to serve the community, not ourselves. And if I lose my job over that, so be it. The room fell silent, the other officers exchanging uneasy glances. Bennett sat back in his chair, clearly wrestling with his next move. Before he could respond, the door opened, and Jack entered, flanked by his lawyer. His expression was a mixture of smugness and defiance as he took a seat at the table. "You wanted to see me, Captain?" Jack said casually, leaning back in his chair. Bennett cleared his throat. "Officer Grant, we're here to discuss the allegations against you and determine how to proceed." Jack shrugged. "Let's get this over with." David turned to Jack, his voice sharp. "These aren't just allegations. We have evidence of misconduct, harassment, intimidation, falsified reports. You've abused your authority, and it's time you answer for it." Jack smirked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Evidence, huh? Or is this just another attempt to make me the scapegoat for a broken system? Let's be real, Captain Reed. This isn't about me. It's about you trying to make yourself look good." David's fists clenched at his sides, but his voice remained steady. "This isn't about me. It's about the people you've targeted, the trust you've broken. You're a disgrace to the badge." Jack leaned forward, his smugness giving way to anger. "Don't act like you're perfect, Reed. You think you're better than me? The only difference is I don't pretend to be a saint. This department's been like this for years, and you've been a part of it just as long as I have." "That's where you're wrong," David shot back. "I've spent my career trying to fix this department, not protect its worst offenders." The room erupted into murmurs as the tension between the two men reached a boiling point. Bennett raised a hand to silence them. "Enough!" he barked. "This isn't a shouting match. Officer Grant, do you deny the allegations against you?" Jack's lawyer intervened, his voice measured. "My client denies all wrongdoing. He was performing his duties to the best of his ability and has been unfairly targeted by an overzealous investigation." David shook his head. "Overzealous? Jack has a documented history of misconduct. If anything, this investigation is overdue." The lawyer opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door opened again, and Rachel Myers stepped in, holding a thick folder. She walked straight to David and handed it to him, ignoring the curious stares of the room. "Captain Reed," Rachel said, her voice firm, "I have additional evidence to support the investigation." David took the folder, flipping through its contents. His eyes widened as he scanned the pages. Falsified reports, internal complaints that had been dismissed without cause, and records of Jack's repeated offenses. He turned to the table, holding up a copy of a falsified report. "This is from one of Jack's arrests last year. The charges were dismissed because of inconsistencies in the report, because Jack fabricated evidence to justify the arrest. And this isn't the only case like it." The room fell silent, the weight of the evidence undeniable. Bennett's expression darkened as he reached for the folder, scanning its contents with a furrowed brow. Rachel continued, her voice unwavering. "I've also included testimonies from officers who witnessed Jack's behavior but were too afraid to come forward. They were intimidated into silence. But they're willing to speak now." Jack's lawyer stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. These are unsubstantiated claims meant to smear my client's reputation." David shot him a cold look. "The only thing smearing Jack's reputation is the truth." Jack's composure cracked as he stood, slamming his hands on the table. "This is a witch hunt. You're all out to get me because I don't play by your rules. Well, guess what? The department's just as dirty as you say I am. You're all hypocrites." David stepped forward, his voice cutting through Jack's rant. "The difference is, we're trying to clean it up, and it starts with holding you accountable." Bennett raised a hand again, his voice strained. "Enough! Everyone, out!" The room hesitated before filing out, leaving Bennett, David, and Rachel alone. Bennett looked at the folder again, his expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. "This changes things," Bennett admitted reluctantly. I'll review the evidence and determine the next steps. But Reed, don't think this means you've won. David met his gaze, unflinching. It's not about winning, Captain. It's about doing what's right. Bennett didn't respond, turning his attention back to the folder as David and Rachel left the room. In the hallway, Rachel turned to David. Do you think he'll act on it? David exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He doesn't have a choice anymore. The evidence is too strong. Jack's run out of places to hide. Rachel nodded, a small smile breaking through her serious expression. Then we keep pushing until the system changes. David smiled faintly. One step at a time. The courtroom was packed, the tension thick as Laura Hayes stood at the plaintiff's table, her presence commanding. David and Charlotte sat beside her, their expressions resolute. Across the aisle, Jack sat stiffly, his lawyer whispering in his ear. All rise, the bailiff announced as the judge entered. The room stood briefly before settling, the trial officially underway. Laura began her opening statement with precision and purpose. Your Honor, members of the jury, this case is not merely about one officer's abuse of power. It's about a pattern, a culture, that has allowed such behavior to go unchecked. My clients, Charlotte and David Reed, are here not just for accountability, but to ensure this abuse ends. She gestured toward the jury. You will hear from witnesses who saw Officer Jack Grant's actions firsthand. You will see evidence of misconduct spanning years, evidence that was ignored or buried. Today, we bring the truth into the light. Jack's lawyer, a sharp-suited man named Paul Greer, rose next. His tone was calm, but pointed. Ladies and gentlemen, my client is a dedicated officer who has spent years serving this community. The claims against him are exaggerated, driven by personal vendettas and media sensationalism. We ask that you focus on the facts, not emotions. The first witness was Mrs. Corey Jenkins, the elderly woman Charlotte had contacted after the confrontation. She took the stand nervously, but spoke with quiet determination. I saw Officer Grant stop Mrs. Reed, she said. It was clear he targeted her for no reason. She didn't do anything wrong, but he kept accusing her, kept escalating. Laura nodded encouragingly. Mrs. Jenkins, did you see any behavior from Charlotte Reed that would justify Officer Grant's actions? No, Mrs. Jenkins replied firmly. She was calm, respectful. He was the one who seemed angry. Greer stood for cross-examination, his tone condescending. Mrs. Jenkins, are you sure you saw everything? Crowded streets can be chaotic. I know what I saw, she said, her voice steady. One by one, other witnesses took the stand. Community members who had seen Jack's behavior that day, and others who recounted past incidents of harassment and misconduct. Each testimony painted a damning picture of a man who had used his badge as a weapon rather than a shield. When Rachel Myers was called to the stand, the atmosphere shifted. She presented herself with a quiet confidence, her words cutting through the courtroom like a blade. Officer Grant has a history of misconduct, she began. I brought evidence of falsified reports, dismissed complaints, and intimidation tactics used to silence those who spoke against him. Laura handed her a file. Can you explain this document to the court? Rachel nodded. This is one of several reports altered to cover up Officer Grant's actions. The original statements were replaced with fabricated narratives to justify unwarranted arrests. Greer's cross-examination was aggressive. Officer Myers, isn't it true you've only been with the department for a short time? How can you claim to understand the complexities of these cases? Rachel met his gaze evenly. I may be new, but I know right from wrong. And what I saw wasn't just wrong. It was deliberate. As the trial progressed, the evidence against Jack piled up. Laura methodically laid out every instance of misconduct, building an unassailable case. The turning point came when a whistleblower within the department testified anonymously, revealing how complaints against Jack had been suppressed under Captain Bennett's watch. Complaints were either dismissed outright or never investigated, the whistleblower explained. Captain Bennett prioritized protecting the department's image over addressing serious issues. This revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom, turning the spotlight on Bennett. Jack took the stand next, his demeanor alternating between defensive and defiant. I was doing my job, he insisted. Sometimes that means making tough calls. People don't always understand that. Laura's cross-examination was relentless. Officer Grant, Can you explain why nearly every complaint against you involves individuals from marginalized communities? Is that a coincidence? Jack shifted uncomfortably. I don't control who gets reported or stopped. I act on information. And yet, Laura pressed, you fabricated evidence, as shown in these reports. Is that also part of your job? Jack's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The jury's expressions reflected their skepticism. The final blow came when Captain Bennett was subpoenaed. Reluctantly, he took the stand, visibly uncomfortable. Laura wasted no time. Captain Bennett, were you aware of Officer Grant's history of complaints? Bennett hesitated before answering. Yes, I was aware. And did you take any meaningful action to address these complaints? I believe the issues were minor, Bennett stammered. Laura raised an eyebrow. Minor. Fabricated reports, unwarranted stops, and harassment are minor? Bennett shifted in his seat, his composure cracking. I made decisions to protect the department. Even if it meant ignoring misconduct? Laura's voice was sharp, her words slicing through his defenses. Bennett fell silent, his inability to respond speaking volumes. By the end of the trial, the jury had heard enough. The verdict was swift and decisive. Jack was found guilty of misconduct and abuse of power. The fallout was immediate. Captain Bennett resigned under mounting pressure, his role in covering up Jack's behavior tarnishing his legacy. Outside the courthouse, Charlotte and David stood with Laura and Rachel, surrounded by supporters and reporters. This isn't the end, Charlotte said into the microphones. This is just the beginning. We've taken the first step toward accountability. But there's more work to be done. Together, we'll keep fighting for justice. The crowd erupted in applause, their voices filled with hope and determination. The news of Jack's conviction spread quickly. The courtroom's gavel had barely echoed when the announcement made its way across Willowbrook. Officer Jack Grant was stripped of his badge and dismissed from the force. Though the outcome was a victory, it was clear to David and Charlotte that this was just the beginning. A week after the trial, Charlotte stood before a packed community center, her voice steady and determined as she addressed the audience. We've won one battle, but the war is far from over. What happened with Jack wasn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem. And now it's up to us to fix it. The room erupted into applause, but Charlotte held up her hand, silencing the crowd. This isn't about revenge. This is about reform, about building a system where accountability isn't the exception. It's the standard. Laura Hayes stepped forward, taking her place beside Charlotte. We're launching the Willowbrook Accountability Coalition, she announced, a movement dedicated to exposing misconduct, supporting whistleblowers, and pushing for legislative reform. And we need all of you to make it work. The energy in the room was electric. People exchanged ideas, signed up for committees, and pledged their support. Charlotte moved among them, speaking to each person with genuine conviction. At home, David watched from the sidelines as Charlotte's movement grew. Flyers for community workshops littered their kitchen table. Phone calls with activists and legal experts filled her evenings. You're unstoppable, David said one night, watching her type furiously on her laptop. Charlotte smiled briefly but didn't look up. We have momentum, David. If we stop now, nothing will change. David sat across from her. You've built something incredible, but you don't have to do it alone. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. I know, she admitted, but I also know how easy it is for people to lose focus. This needs to stay at the forefront. No distractions. David leaned back, studying her. Then let's make it bigger. We've seen how far this system is willing to go to protect itself. If we want lasting change, we need to reach beyond Willowbrook. Charlotte nodded slowly, her resolve deepening. The following month, the Willowbrook Accountability Coalition hosted its first major conference. Activists, civil rights attorneys, and reform-minded officers from across the state gathered to share strategies and resources. Charlotte gave the keynote speech, her words capturing the urgency of the moment. This is our chance to rewrite the rules, she said, to ensure that justice isn't just a word. It's a reality. This isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about creating something better. David, standing at the edge of the stage, watched her with pride. For years, he had fought within the system, trying to chip away at its flaws. Now, he saw the power of working outside it, alongside the community it was supposed to serve. Meanwhile, the fallout from Jack's conviction rippled through the Willowbrook Police Department. Captain Bennett's resignation left a leadership vacuum, and calls for an independent review of the department grew louder. Officers who had once aligned with Jack now distanced themselves, while others, emboldened by Rachel Myers's bravery, began speaking out about systemic issues they had long ignored. Rachel, now a key figure in the coalition, sat with David in a small cafe near the precinct one afternoon. "It feels different," she said. "People are finally talking about the things we've all seen but we're too scared to confront." David nodded. "Change starts with conversations, but it won't stick unless the culture changes too. That's the hardest part." Rachel leaned forward. "You've been in this system longer than I have. Do you think it can be fixed?" David hesitated before answering. "It has to be. Otherwise, everything we fought for is meaningless." As months passed, the coalition gained traction. Charlotte worked tirelessly to ensure its message stayed clear and its goals actionable. Legislation inspired by the coalition's work began to take shape, focusing on transparency, community oversight, and stronger protections for whistleblowers. One evening, as she and David sat in their living room reviewing proposed policies, Charlotte looked at him thoughtfully. "Do you ever think about leaving the force?" David considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But part of me feels like I can do more good by staying in. It's not easy, but if I leave, someone else with Jack's mindset could take my place." Charlotte nodded. "Then you stay. But promise me one thing. Don't let them change who you are." He reached for her hand. "I won't. And you, don't burn yourself out. The world needs your fire." The coalition's work began to yield results. Local governments adopted new policies for officer accountability. Community police relations improved as more citizens participated in oversight boards. Though progress was slow, it was tangible. One day, as Charlotte and David walked through the town square, they passed a mural depicting figures from the movement, Charlotte among them. A group of teenagers stood nearby, discussing the change they wanted to see in Willowbrook. "They're the future," David said quietly. Charlotte smiled. "And this is just the beginning." The story of Charlotte and David isn't just about one couple standing up against injustice. It's a reminder of the power of resilience, community, and the courage to demand change. Their journey shows us that even in the face of systemic flaws and personal threats, one voice can inspire many, and many voices can ignite a movement. As we leave their story, one question remains. What will you do to challenge injustice and push for accountability in your own community? If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue bringing stories of hope, courage, and change to light. Together, we can create a brighter, more just future.
It was an ordinary afternoon in Jacksonville, Florida. The sun seemed to shine especially brightly over the residential neighborhoods, reflecting off the luxury cars parked along the immaculately clean streets of Arlington Hills. The local shops were bustling, with people coming and going, carrying bags and exchanging distracted conversations, a calm that seemed unshakable. Inside a park patrol car at the corner of a charming cafe, Randy Thompson twirled his keys between his fingers, his gaze fixed on a black SUV parked across the street. Something about the scene unsettled him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Perhaps it was the driver, a black man, impeccably dressed in a suit, sitting behind the wheel of a car that cost more than Randy would make in 2 years. "Something's not right," he muttered to himself. Next to him, the patrol car's radio crackled with routine updates. Nothing out of the ordinary. Minor thefts, medical assistance calls, the kind of stuff Randy dismissed as trivial. He felt he was destined for something bigger, but years of patrolling peaceful neighborhoods had left him impatient, like a caged lion. He was always on the lookout for something or someone to justify his simmering anger. Randy pressed the radio button and called dispatch. "Unit 205, at the corner of Arlington and Main. I'm approaching a suspicious vehicle," he said with a confidence that seemed misplaced. Dispatch responded mechanically, giving standard authorization, but there was nothing suspicious about the scene. Just a man parked in a car, checking something on his phone. A few feet away, Elijah Brooks ended a quick phone call with his wife, Donna. "Yes, honey, I'm on my way," he said, glancing at his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. He was running late for an event at the Mayport Naval Base, where he was set to be honored for more than 25 years of impeccable service in the Navy. Despite his tardiness, his demeanor was calm. Elijah had always been that way. Focused, disciplined, a man who rarely let his emotions show. But something about that day felt off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. He just felt it. Elijah adjusted his tie in the rear-view mirror, ensuring the knot was perfect. He knew he'd be surrounded by high-ranking officers and political figures, and he needed to look impeccable, not because he cared about their opinions, but because that's how he carried himself. A leader, an example. He was about to start the car when he noticed a patrol car pulling up beside him. The officer stepped out slowly, adjusting his belt and holster as if wanting to be noticed. Elijah sighed. He recognized the type immediately. The rigid walk, the hand hovering near the gun, the exaggerated air of authority. He had encountered many men like this over the years. "Good afternoon, officer," Elijah said, rolling down the window calmly. "Is there a problem?" Randy didn't respond immediately. He assessed Elijah with a sharp, piercing gaze, as if searching for something. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" he asked, his voice hard and direct. "Parked. Waiting to get on my way," Elijah replied, keeping his voice controlled but firm. He knew how quickly these encounters could escalate. "Why do you ask?" "You look out of place," Randy said, deliberately ignoring the polite tone of Elijah's response. He placed his hands on his belt, ensuring the gun at his side was prominently visible. License, registration, and ID. Now, Elijah stared at Randy for a moment, trying to gauge the seriousness of the situation. He opened the glove compartment slowly, aware that every move was being scrutinized. He pulled out his driver's license and, along with it, his military ID. "I'm Commander Elijah Brooks, an officer in the United States Navy. I'm on my way to a military event. Here are my documents." Randy took the papers, but didn't bother to look at them. Instead, he crossed his arms, as if Elijah's introduction was irrelevant. "Commander, huh? And what exactly brought you to this neighborhood? Looking for something, maybe?" "Officer, I'm trying to understand where you're going with this," Elijah said, his tone now more serious. "I'm fully aware of my rights, and so far, you haven't provided a clear reason for the stop." "I give the orders here, Mr. Brooks," Randy shot back, deliberately refusing to address Elijah by his military title. He stepped back, his hand resting on his weapon. "Step out of the vehicle." Slowly, a small crowd was beginning to gather nearby. Pedestrians stopped in their tracks, some pulling out their phones as the atmosphere on the street began to shift. Elijah noticed the curious and concerned stares but remained calm. He'd been in far more tense situations than this, but not here, not in his own country. "Officer," Elijah began, trying to defuse what was starting to feel inevitable, "you're making a mistake, and I suggest you stop before this goes too far." Randy didn't reply. He raised his voice, as if speaking to both Elijah and the crowd. "Get out of the vehicle now, or I'll remove you by force." "That's an order." The tension in the air was palpable, and the silence among the onlookers only made the situation more unbearable. Elijah knew that at this moment, any wrong move could trigger a disaster. With a heavy sigh, he unlocked the door and stepped out slowly, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "On your knees," Randy ordered, his voice now laced with hatred. Elijah hesitated, locking eyes with the officer in a moment that seemed to stretch on forever. But with a gun pointed at him and Randy's cold, unyielding glare, there was no choice. He knelt on the cold pavement, feeling the weight not just of the humiliation, but of what this moment symbolized for him, and for everyone watching. The weight of the situation bore down on Elijah as he knelt on the pavement, his back straight and his hands clasped loosely behind his head. His mind raced, not with fear, but with a controlled, simmering anger that he'd learned to channel after decades of service. He could hear the whispers from the gathering crowd, see the glimmer of cell phone cameras, catching every humiliating second. But the loudest thing in the air was Randy's voice, sharp and commanding, as though the situation wasn't a shameful display of prejudice, but a triumphant assertion of power. "You think you're special because of that uniform?" Randy sneered, standing over Elijah, his hand still resting on the holster of his gun. "Everyone's equal under my jurisdiction. You don't get a pass because of some military badge." Elijah glanced up, his jaw tight. The crowd had grown larger, with several people openly recording the scene. A woman in her mid-30s was whispering into her phone, likely calling for help. Nearby, a teenage boy muttered, "This is messed up," earning a sharp glance from his mother, who pulled him back to the curb. Elijah could feel the collective outrage in the air, but for now, it was a silent one. "Officer," Elijah began, his voice measured, "you're making a grave mistake. I've given you my identification. I've followed every one of your commands. There's no reason to escalate this any further." Randy ignored him, circling like a predator. "You Navy types, always thinking you're above the law. Let me tell you something. This is my street, my rules. And if I think you're suspicious, you're suspicious. End of story." Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself. Randy's words didn't cut him, but they did something worse. They confirmed every stereotype Elijah had fought against his entire life. No amount of medals, rank, or service had shielded him from being reduced to a mere suspicious figure in the eyes of someone like Randy. The crowd murmured louder as Randy pulled out his handcuffs and stepped closer. "Stand up," he barked. Elijah hesitated, his instincts warning him of how quickly this could spiral out of control. But with dozens of phones recording, he knew his best option was compliance. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his movements deliberate. Randy wasted no time, grabbing Elijah's arm and twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. Elijah winced but didn't resist as the cold metal of the cuffs bit into his wrists. "Is this really necessary?" Elijah asked, turning his head slightly to meet Randy's eyes. "You're arresting me with no cause, no justification. This isn't law enforcement. It's abuse of power. You don't get to tell me how to do my job," Randy snapped, tightening the cuffs. "And I don't owe you an explanation." At that moment, a woman from the crowd stepped forward. She was young, probably in her late 20s, her curly hair pulled back into a ponytail. She held her phone up high, the red recording glaring in the corner of the screen. "This is illegal," she called out, her voice firm but shaking slightly. "You can't just cuff someone for no reason. He's done nothing wrong." Randy turned sharply, his face flushed with anger. "Back off, lady. This is official police business." The woman didn't move. "We're all watching," she said, her voice steadying. "We're recording, and we're not going to let you get away with this." Randy's glare darkened, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the growing tension. "That's enough, Officer Thompson." The crowd parted as Captain Sarah Martinez, Randy's direct supervisor, approached the scene. She was dressed in her police uniform, her dark hair tied neatly at the back of her head, and her expression was a mixture of anger and disbelief. Behind her were two other officers, both looking uneasy as they surveyed the crowd and the cameras. "Captain," Randy said, his tone defensive, "I was just handling." "Handling what?" Sarah snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs of the onlookers. She marched straight to Elijah, her eyes widening slightly as recognition dawned. "Oh my God," she muttered under her breath. "Commander Brooks?" Elijah, still standing with his wrists cuffed, met her gaze. "Captain Martinez, good to see someone who recognizes me," he said, his voice calm but edged with restrained anger. Sarah's face turned pale. She turned to Randy, her expression hardening. "Take those cuffs off him. Right now." Randy hesitated. "Captain, I was..." "Now!" Sarah barked, her voice echoing across the street. The crowd fell silent, the tension crackling in the air like an electric current. Randy's jaw clenched as he reluctantly pulled out his keys and unlocked the cuffs. Elijah flexed his wrists as they came free, but his posture remained composed, a testament to his years of training. Sarah stepped closer to Randy, her voice low but furious. "What the hell were you thinking? Do you even know who this is?" "I don't care who he is," Randy shot back, his voice defiant. "He looked suspicious, and I acted accordingly." "Suspicious?" Sarah's voice rose again, and the crowd leaned in, their phones capturing every word. "You pointed a gun at a decorated commander in the United States Navy, a man on his way to a military event. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I did my job," Randy insisted, but his voice wavered slightly. "No, you didn't," Sarah said, stepping closer until they were almost nose to nose. "You abused your authority, humiliated an innocent man, and made this department look like a joke. Do you realize how many cameras are on us right now? Do you realize what's going to happen when this goes viral?" Randy's face flushed red, but he didn't respond. Sarah turned back to Elijah, her expression softening. "Commander Brooks, I am so sorry for what's happened here. Please know this does not represent the values of our department." "With all due respect, Captain," Elijah said, his voice steady, "it does. Or he wouldn't have felt empowered to do this in the first place." Sarah flinched at the truth in his words. She turned to the other officers. "Escort Officer Thompson back to the precinct. I'll deal with him personally." When they hesitated, she added sharply, "Now." The officers moved toward Randy, who took a step back. "You're really going to do this? In front of everyone?" he asked, his voice dripping with indignation. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Yes, because someone has to show the people watching that we're capable of holding our own accountable." As the officers led Randy away, the crowd erupted into murmurs, a mixture of relief and outrage. Elijah turned to Sarah, his expression unreadable. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Sarah nodded. "I know, and I'll do everything I can to make it right." But Elijah wasn't sure if anything could. Not after this. The sun had dipped lower into the Jacksonville skyline, casting long shadows across the city. Inside the crowded briefing room at the police precinct, the air was thick with tension. Elijah sat at the far end of a rectangular table, his back straight and hands folded on the surface. Though outwardly composed, his eyes betrayed a quiet storm brewing within him. Across from him sat Sarah Martinez, the weight of her own authority pressing down on her like a stone. To her right sat Chief Raymond Harris, a man in his mid-50s with a stern expression and a reputation for prioritizing the department's image above all else. Elijah wasn't here for an apology. He was here for accountability. "Commander Brooks," Chief Harris began, his voice measured but detached, "let me start by expressing the department's sincerest regrets for what transpired earlier today. Officer Thompson's actions were unacceptable and do not align with the values we uphold." Elijah raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The word regret hung in the air, hollow and insufficient. "We've already taken immediate action," Harris continued. "Officer Thompson has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. And I can assure you, if found guilty of misconduct, he will face disciplinary action." Elijah leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "Found guilty? With all due respect, Chief, this isn't up for debate. There's a crowd full of witnesses and hours of footage circulating online that prove exactly what happened." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but Harris held his ground. "We understand that, Commander, but due process—" "Spare me the procedural excuses," Elijah interrupted, his tone sharp but controlled. "I've served this country for over 25 years, Chief. I've led men and women into war zones, upheld the highest standards of discipline and integrity. And yet today, I was treated like a criminal, like my life didn't matter. Officer Thompson didn't just humiliate me. He humiliated your department, the same department that allowed him to operate unchecked Harris frowned, his jaw tightening. Sarah cleared her throat, stepping in to mediate. "Commander Brooks," she said softly, "I understand your anger. Believe me, I do. And I don't disagree with you. But please know that we are committed to addressing this thoroughly." Elijah shifted his gaze to her, his voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. "Captain Martinez, I appreciate your intervention earlier. Truly. But this is bigger than today. I refuse to let this get swept under the rug like so many other incidents." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Harris finally broke it with a sigh, leaning back in his chair. "You're right. We can't ignore this. But you have to understand, cases like this are complicated. There's a system in place, and that system is broken," Elijah countered. "You want to talk about systems? Let's talk about how Officer Thompson's behavior is no isolated incident. How many complaints has he had? How many red flags did you ignore before today?" Sarah's face tightened, her eyes darting briefly to Harris. It was clear she knew something but wasn't ready to speak. Elijah caught the flicker of hesitation and pressed further. "Captain Martinez, you've worked with him. You're his superior. Don't tell me you didn't notice anything." Sarah opened her mouth to respond but faltered. Harris shot her a warning glance, but Elijah was relentless. "If this department wants to regain even a shred of credibility, it starts with honesty. So I'll ask again, how many complaints?" Finally, Sarah exhaled, her shoulders sagging. "5, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the past 3 years, there have been 5 formal complaints filed against Officer Thompson, all for excessive force or racial profiling." Harris stiffened. "Sarah, no." She cut him off, her voice firm. "He deserves to know the truth. Those complaints were dismissed, every single one of them, some due to lack of evidence, others because the victims didn't want to pursue legal action. But that doesn't mean they weren't valid." Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line. His anger was no longer simmering. It was boiling. "Dismissed," he repeated. "You had 5 chances to stop him, and you did nothing. And now you want me to trust that you'll thoroughly address this." "Commander," Harris began, but Elijah wasn't finished. "Do you know what it feels like," Elijah said, his voice rising slightly, "to dedicate your life to serving this country, to sacrificing everything for the ideals of justice and equality, only to be reduced to a suspicious figure because of the color of your skin? Do you know what it feels like to kneel in front of a crowd with a gun pointed at your head, knowing that no rank, no title, no service will save you from the assumptions of a man like Thompson?" The room was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone present. Sarah looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. Harris shifted uncomfortably, but Elijah didn't give him the chance to respond. "This isn't just about me," Elijah continued, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "It's about every person who's been stopped, harassed, or humiliated by someone wearing your badge. It's about the system that protects them. And if you think a suspension or a public apology will make this go away, you're sorely mistaken." Before Harris could respond, the door to the room opened and an officer entered, looking nervous. "Chief Harris," he said, holding a file. "You're going to want to see this." Harris took the file and flipped it open, his expression darkening with every page. Sarah leaned over to glance at it, her face paling as she read. Elijah watched them carefully, his instincts telling him this was important. "What is it?" Elijah asked. Harris hesitated, then slid the file across the table. "It's Thompson's record." Elijah opened the file and scanned the contents. His stomach twisted as he read through incident reports, internal memos, and informal complaints that never saw the light of day. It wasn't just the 5 complaints Sarah had mentioned. There were dozens of incidents, some going back nearly a decade. Many were marked as resolved or closed due to insufficient evidence. Others had been quietly settled with payouts to the victims. But the most damning part was a memo from 3 years ago, signed by none other than Harris himself. It was a recommendation to reassign Thompson to administrative duty after an incident involving excessive force against a teenager. The recommendation had been ignored. "You knew," Elijah said, his voice low but seething. "You knew he was a problem, and you let him stay on the streets." Harris looked like he'd been caught in a trap. "It's not that simple. Officers—" "Don't," Elijah interrupted, standing up. He held the file in his hand like a weapon. "You don't get to justify this. Not to me, and not to the people out there demanding answers." Sarah stood as well, her voice quiet but resolute. "Commander, I'll do everything in my power to make this right." Elijah turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Then start by taking responsibility. All of you." He left the room without another word, the file still in his hand. As he walked out of the precinct, the crowd of reporters and protesters outside parted to let him through. He didn't stop to speak. Not yet. He wasn't done. Inside, Sarah and Harris sat in silence. For the first time in her career, Sarah felt the weight of her complicity. And for the first time in his, Harris realized this wouldn't be contained. The night after the confrontation at the precinct, Jacksonville was alive with tension. The footage of Elijah Brooks kneeling on the pavement with Randy Thompson standing over him had gone viral. The hashtags #JusticeForElijah and #AccountabilityNow were trending nationwide. And news networks ran the story on a loop, dissecting every second of the video. Protesters had gathered outside the Jacksonville Police Department, holding signs that read "End Racist Policing" and "We Stand with Commander Brooks." The crowd swelled by the hour, fueled by outrage and a collective call for change. Inside his home, Elijah sat in his dimly lit living room, staring at the file he had taken from the precinct. His wife, Donna, sat across from him, her eyes filled with both worry and quiet fury. "You haven't said much since you got back," Donna said, breaking the silence. "What's on your mind?" Elijah leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the armrest. "It's worse than I thought, Donna. Thompson wasn't just a bad apple. He's a symptom of a much larger problem. Dozens of complaints, all buried. And Harris knew. He knew and still allowed that man to patrol our streets." Donna shook her head, her voice rising slightly. "You shouldn't have to be the one carrying this burden. This isn't just your fight, Elijah. Let someone else." "It is my fight," Elijah interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "I can't ignore this. If I stay quiet, then I'm no better than the people who covered for him." Donna sighed, folding her arms. "I know you're right. I hate seeing you go through this. It's not fair." Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Fairness hasn't been a luxury I've been afforded in a long time, Donna. But this isn't about me anymore. It's about everyone who's been on the wrong side of men like Thompson. I have to do something." Donna reached out, placing a hand over his. "Then do it. But promise me one thing. Don't let this destroy you." Elijah met her gaze, his eyes softening. "I promise." The following morning, Elijah stood at a podium in front of a sea of reporters, protesters, and curious onlookers outside the Jacksonville Police Department. Cameras flashed as he adjusted the microphone, taking a moment to steady himself. Behind him, members of the community and several retired military officers stood in silent solidarity. "Good morning," Elijah began, his voice clear and steady. "I want to start by thanking everyone here today. Those who have stood with me, those who have shared my story, and those who demand accountability. Your support means more than I can express." He paused, scanning the crowd. The silence was heavy, every ear hanging on his words. "What happened to me 2 days ago wasn't an isolated incident," he continued. "It wasn't a case of one bad officer having a bad day. It was the result of a system that has allowed individuals like Officer Randy Thompson to abuse their authority without consequence. A system that has prioritized silence over accountability. And that system has failed us all." Applause rippled through the crowd, but Elijah held up a hand to quiet them. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has been profiled, harassed, or mistreated by those who swore to protect and serve. It's about the trust that has been broken between law enforcement and the communities they are supposed to serve. And it's about the lives that have been destroyed because no one was willing to stand up and say, enough. At that moment, Sarah Martinez stepped out of the police station and stood near the edge of the crowd, her presence drawing murmurs. Elijah noticed her but continued speaking, his tone sharpening. "I've seen the documents," he said. "I've read the complaints. Officer Thompson wasn't an outlier. He was protected, shielded by a department that prioritized its reputation over the safety of its citizens. This isn't just about him. It's about every officer who looked the other way, every superior who dismissed a complaint, every leader who allowed this culture to persist." The crowd erupted in cheers and shouts of agreement, but Elijah's expression remained stoic. He wasn't here for applause. "I am calling for a full, independent investigation into the Jacksonville Police Department," Elijah declared. "I am calling for transparency, for accountability, and for real reform. And I won't stop until we get it." The crowd roared in approval, and Elijah stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding. As he turned to leave, he found himself face to face with Sarah. "Commander Brooks," she said, her voice softer than he expected. "Can we talk?" Elijah studied her for a moment before nodding. They stepped away from the crowd, finding a quieter spot near the edge of the station. Sarah looked nervous, her hands clasped in front of her. "I owe you an apology," she began. "Not just for what happened that day, but for everything that led up to it. You were right. I should have done more. I should have spoken up sooner." Elijah crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Why didn't you?" Sarah hesitated, searching for the right words. "Fear," she admitted. "Fear of retaliation. Fear of losing my job. Fear of going against the grain. But that's not an excuse. I let my fear blind me to what was right." Elijah tilted his head slightly. "And what are you going to do about it now?" Sarah straightened her posture, determination flickering in her eyes. "I've already started. I submitted a formal statement to the state attorney's office this morning. I detailed everything I know about Thompson's history and the department's failure to act. I'm also stepping down from my position as captain." Elijah's eyes widened slightly. "You're resigning?" "I'm taking responsibility," Sarah clarified. "And I'm making space for someone who will lead with integrity. But before I go, I'm going to help you get that investigation. Whatever you need, I'll back you." Elijah studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Captain Martinez." "Just Sarah," she said with a faint smile. "I think I've lost the right to that title." They parted ways, and Elijah returned home, exhausted but resolute. He knew the fight was far from over. The investigation would face resistance. The media frenzy would eventually die down, and the systemic change he sought would take years, if not decades. But for the first time, he felt like progress was possible. That evening, as Elijah sat on his porch with Donna, he received an email notification on his phone. It was from an investigative journalist who had obtained additional records on Thompson and other officers with histories of misconduct. The journalist wanted to collaborate, to shine an even brighter light on the corruption within the department. Elijah's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what he did. Back at the precinct, Randy Thompson sat alone in a small, windowless room. His badge and gun had been taken, and he was now the subject of not just an internal investigation, but also mounting public outrage. The walls were closing in, and for the first time, Randy realized that he wasn't the untouchable figure he had always believed himself to be. In another room, Chief Harris stared at his own reflection in a glass window. He knew his days as police chief were numbered. The truth about Thompson's file, combined with Elijah's public demands, had set off a chain reaction he couldn't control. The system was crumbling, and for many, that was the first step toward rebuilding something better. 2 months had passed since the incident outside the cafe in Arlington Hills, But the echoes of that day continued to reverberate throughout Jacksonville and far beyond. What began as a single act of injustice had snowballed into something larger, something Elijah Brooks had never anticipated. The city was at a crossroads, grappling with its past and its future. On a crisp November morning, Elijah sat on the stage of the Jacksonville Civic Center. He was flanked by activists, military leaders, and community organizers, all gathered for a public forum on police reform. The room was packed. Hundreds of people filled the seats, while thousands more watched online. It was a pivotal moment, and Elijah knew it. As he adjusted the microphone in front of him, the audience fell silent. He took a moment to look out at the sea of faces, diverse, determined, and hopeful. He recognized some from the protests, others from meetings and community discussions over the past few weeks. Each of them was here for the same reason: to demand change. "Good morning," Elijah began, his deep voice carrying across the room. "Before we start today, I want to take a moment to reflect. 2 months ago, I was a victim of something many people in this country experience every day. I was humiliated, dehumanized, and treated as though my life and my service meant nothing." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But I was fortunate. I survived. Many others who look like me haven't. And it's their voices we need to amplify. Because this isn't just about me. It never was." A wave of applause rolled through the room, but Elijah held up a hand to quiet it. "Since that day, we've seen the city come together in ways I never imagined. We've protested, we've demanded accountability, and we've pushed for reform. And while there's still so much work to do, I want to take a moment to recognize the progress we've made." He gestured to the far end of the stage, where Sarah Martinez stood quietly, her face calm but resolute. Captain Sarah Martinez, someone who was once part of the problem, chose to step forward and take responsibility. She didn't just resign her position. She became one of the loudest advocates for reform within the department. Her courage is a reminder that change begins when we hold ourselves accountable. Sarah nodded slightly, her expression a mixture of humility and gratitude. The audience applauded, and Elijah continued. "Over the past 2 months, a full independent investigation into the Jacksonville Police Department has been launched. Already, it has uncovered decades of misconduct, abuse, and corruption, things that many of us suspected but never had the evidence to prove. And because of this investigation, multiple officers, including Randy Thompson, have been formally charged with misconduct and abuse of power." The mention of Randy's name brought a murmur to the crowd. Elijah's tone didn't waver. Randy Thompson wasn't just one bad officer. He was part of a system that enabled and protected him. But that system is being dismantled piece by piece, starting here in Jacksonville. And that's because of the people in this room, the people watching online, and the people who refuse to stay silent. Elijah's words were met with a standing ovation, but once again he signaled for quiet. "I want to leave you with this," he said, his voice softening. "Real change doesn't happen overnight. It's slow, painful, and often discouraging, but it's possible, and it starts with all of us, holding each other accountable, educating ourselves, and refusing to accept anything less than justice." He stepped back from the microphone as the room erupted into cheers. For the first time in weeks, Elijah allowed himself to smile. It wasn't the end, but it was a step forward. That evening, Elijah returned home to find Donna waiting for him on the porch. She held 2 mugs of coffee, steam curling up into the cool air. He sat down beside her, letting out a tired but contented sigh. "You did good today," Donna said, handing him a mug. "You always know how to move a room." Elijah chuckled softly, taking a sip of the coffee. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone. The community. The people who showed up. This was bigger than me, Donna." She reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "It always is with you. That's what I love about you. But don't forget to take a moment for yourself, too." "I will," he promised, leaning back in his chair. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. It was fleeting, he knew, but it was enough for now. Across town, Sarah Martinez sat in a modest office at her new job. After resigning from the police force, she had been hired as a director of a nonprofit dedicated to police accountability and community relations. It was a role she never expected to find herself in, but one she embraced fully. As she sifted through emails, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Elijah. "Thank you for everything. Keep pushing." Sarah smiled, typing a quick response, "You too. We're just getting started." At the Jacksonville Police Department, the winds of change were undeniable. Chief Harris had been forced to resign after the investigation revealed his role in covering up misconduct. A new chief was brought in, a woman of color from a neighboring city with a reputation for reform. Training programs were overhauled. New oversight committees were formed, and policies around the use of force were rewritten. It wasn't perfect. There was resistance from within, and progress was slow. But for the first time in decades, there was hope. As for Randy Thompson, his life had unraveled completely. He had been fired from the department, stripped of his badge and gun. The charges against him were severe: multiple counts of abuse of power, falsifying reports, and excessive force. He had become a symbol not of authority, but of the very system that so many wanted to dismantle. And while he awaited trial, he was alone, abandoned by the department that once protected him. Months later, Elijah stood in front of his mirror, straightening his tie. He was preparing for another event, this time in Washington, D.C., where he had been invited to speak before a congressional committee on police reform. It was an honor, but more importantly, it was a platform to keep pushing for change. As he adjusted the knot of his tie, Donna appeared in the doorway. "You look good," she said, smiling. "Thanks," he replied. "You think they're ready for me?" Donna chuckled. "Oh, they don't stand a chance." Elijah smiled, kissed her on the cheek, and headed out the door. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, he felt like they were winning. And that was enough.